Hello, and welcome back to CODE&CLOUD, the podcast where we explore the intersection of technology and strategy for modern digital projects. I'm Rauno, and today I'm proud to host from open model to global infrastructure, the role of open source in the cloud. It's one of the most fascinating dynamics in our industry. Think about it, the massive hyperscaler cloud platform that power our global economy is AWS, Google Cloud, Azure. They are built on a foundation of open source software. Technologies born from a spirit of free collaboration now form the bedrock of the world's most profitable commercial enterprises. To help us unpack this complex and crucial topic, I am thrilled to introduce our guest speaker for today. I'm really happy to host a person with an incredible experience in both the open source world and the cloud computing services. Justin Erenkrantz, since more than 20 years, a relevant member of the Apache Software Foundation, where he also served as a president, a long-time contributor to several well-known open source projects such as Apache HTTP Server and Subversion. So welcome on stage to Justin.
Hey, Rauno, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here and share some of my thoughts around kind of open source and kind of the cloud.
No, thanks you for accepting my invitation. Thanks a lot. Welcome to CODE&CLOUD. Do you want to say just a few words to present yourself to our audience?
Yeah. So I think you did a good job of introducing myself. My name is Justin Erenkrantz. I'm a longtime member of the Apache Software Foundation. I was lucky enough to be on the board of directors and serve as president of the foundation, probably from in the late 2000s, 2007, 2009. So it's been a while since I've been president, but still involved with open source. And, since, recently, I've been at Bloomberg and Major League Baseball and focusing on, a lot of the private cloud and then kind of the public cloud. So, taking all of the open source experience I have and thinking about, how do you bring that to scale? So definitely have lots of thoughts to share with you and kind of the audience around open source in the cloud.
I invite you to talk about this subject explicitly because of your past experience of both the open source and the cloud environments. Looking back at the time that cloud environments were burning and were starting to increase, it's hard to imagine the cloud existing without the foundational open source technology like Linux, the first point, and OpenStack, for example. How did the open source philosophy of collaboration and free access fundamentally shape the cloud's initial architecture and business model, turning infrastructure into a shareable, scalable commodity?
I think there's a couple of ways to think about kind of the cloud. I think there is, the role of the cloud provider. So this could be an Amazon or Google or Microsoft, but then you have all of the workloads that kind of clients, bring to kind of the clouds. And, I think certainly Amazon, basically, was really the first, big public cloud that got a lot of traction and kind of a lot of mind share. And, one of the things that they, made a decision on was embracing the use of open source by the customers. And so basically people could run Linux and they made sure it was a really good experience for running the open source software stacks within their environment. And then that quickly led to pretty much being table stakes to pretty much every kind of customer, of these clouds needing to be able to support open source software and do that. But then you saw kind of the rise of OpenStack, and there were things like Eucalyptus, and they were definitely open source. And so, one of the experiences I had at Bloomberg, where they sort of the rationale was to control the infrastructure end to end, having private MPLS network, having private kind of connectivity, and to be able to give guarantees. And so a lot of what we did at Bloomberg was to bring the private cloud, but leveraging open source and basically being able to give that experience that developers were familiar with from an Amazon, kind of environment of, okay, I have infrastructure as a service, but then being able to kind of power that through kind of open source and all of the infrastructure that was built on that. And so you've got these two kind of perspectives of it, of the kind of the end application workloads that certainly embraced open source from the very beginning. And then I think you saw environments like OpenStack. But then now you see as kind of the cloud has evolved, you've seen a lot of the infrastructure that an Amazon relies on, and it's been very fascinating over 20 years to see their shift in open source kind of evolution. And one of the successors to me as president of the Apache Software Foundation, worked at Amazon, and basically, kind of the mentality of open source, and really got to integrated to not just Amazon, but Microsoft and Google. And so you see a lot of things like Amazon's done stuff with Firecracker of kind of open sourcing their hypervisor. That Google has shared that a lot of their Google Cloud, is now based on, kind of open source hypervisors, and, kind of while Microsoft, kind of still relies on Hyper-V, as their underpinning hypervisor, but they've been slowly, open sourcing all the bits kind of around it, and certainly adapting, things like Kubernetes and things like that. And so you definitely see, and then Oracle Cloud as more recent, kind of player at scale. They're certainly doing a lot of open source and kind of contributing, and participating in the ecosystem. And this is just all, the table stakes of the application developers and all the infrastructure and all the runtimes and all the services. Just for the most part, they're going to be open source. They're going to be somewhere down the stack. You're going to be running, kind of open source, libraries. And one of these things over the 25 years I've been involved with open source to see that, that wasn't the case when I started out. It was proprietary operating systems, it was proprietary library. For the most part, kind of big organizations, are, increasingly relying on open source, kind of software, and then, deploying that on not just, kind of a single cloud. A lot of organizations do multi-cloud, and then we can get into, some of the tools that enable, kind of the multi-cloud. Is that real? Is it not? All of those items.
Open source software as platforms, as fundamental components for solution as Kubernetes, Redis, Kafka, and many others. They've been born in the open, and now they are the de facto standard for modern infrastructure, for the, let's say, cloud native architecture. So how this new generation of open source tool not only enable but actively drive the shift to the cloud native architecture, and what does this tell us about where the next wave of innovation will come from or could come from?
Yeah, and I think, really seeing this evolution of, when Amazon started, there really wasn't Docker. That wasn't really a thing that was in the mind share. And so you started to see like, the primitives that, Amazon started with was basically, S3 buckets and, ECS VMs. And it was like, well, how do you create a VM? How do you manage that? And I think, kind of the introduction of containers as a philosophy, really started to kind of revolutionize, the thinking. And, now, kind of Kubernetes is over 10 years old, and it's kind of an evolution of the containers. And how do you manage, kind of, fleets of software, and doing that kind of with containers. And, that's, that shift from, okay, you had your initial primitive being, storage and compute. Okay, now you kind of get the introduction of kind of containers and now OCI images, things like that, and be able to take an artifact that I know what it is, be able to deploy that, be able to do that at scale. Google then, open sourced, Kubernetes, and put a lot of, effort into that. And now that's definitely, again, now table stakes that, taking a workload for the most part today in a modern, native. It's not just the primitives of, kind of compute and stores at a VM or an S3 level. It's like, do you have Kubernetes? Do I have Helm charts? Can I bring that in. And so I think some of the things we'll talk about is what are the obligations to keep that updated? What are the demands of the customers to say, okay, I want you to, take advantage of the upstream, efforts. And we can certainly talk about, what I've observed over the years around how these different providers, kind of come at, interacting with the upstream kind of ecosystem that, they're built on top of. And, there's an obligation to kind of contribute back. And, that's a big, thinking that I think is crucial to kind of understanding the larger dynamic.
Yeah, when we talk about the relationship between the open source solution and the cloud provider, there is also a bit of a paradox to consider, because cloud provider, they have built massive empires by offering managed services based on open source projects like PostgreSQL or Redis or other. From an ethical and also systemic viewpoint, what is the responsibility of these giants to contribute back to the project they profit from? And how do we ensure that the sustainability of the open source, say, commons when it's so easily commercialized on the cloud platform?
Yeah, this is, a great, philosophical kind of question. And I don't think there are any easy answers. And, I'm informed by the work of Red Monk and Stephen O'Grady. And, he's thought a lot about this and talked about this, kind of at length. So a lot of what, I'm going to say is informed by, his views, but I largely agree with them. And, you see this dynamic of, okay, you have all of this open source. What is the obligation to providers?
Yeah.
And I think, kind of Postgres is kind of an easy example, but I think the Redis and the Valkey is a really fascinating, ecosystem to kind of understand. You basically had, Redis as a open source project that was largely one, kind of individual. There were a couple of other contributors. He then basically was like, I'm kind of done here, and basically, passed it off to a commercial entity. But all the meanwhile, you had, the major public clouds contributing and building, and you had application users, relying on, Redis. And it was like, okay, from in memory, kind of caching, what do you, do? And it was like, yeah, you use Redis and you do that at scale. But what you saw was a fundamental tension between this one individual Redis Labs organization with the hyperscalers of what a Google or an Amazon, Microsoft, were wanting to see. And, it created this friction where, a lot of the work that the Amazon or the Google developers who were responsible for those managed services couldn't get their changes into the upstream because the maintainers of the project had a kind of a commercial kind of incentive not to allow things to be in the open source product and basically have a commercial version. And that basically kind of escalated in a fork in Valkey. And basically it was a lot of the Amazon, credit to Madeline and some of the other kind of contributors into the early days of Valkey that were like, no, we're going to go take this, before the relicense by Redis Labs, and we're going to go do all of the things that we need to have as a kind of a managed provider and be able to kind of remove that tension that existed because you had this commercial organization that was spearheading, kind of the Redis effort, and it really doing the community a service. And basically, people had adopted it because of the, kind of the licensing, and it goes to a, restricted license. Well, you're going to have the people do a fork. I mean, it was just 1,000-foot view of, taking my open source, experience. All obvious. This was all, a very clear response. But you see kind of these tensions, and it was one of these things that it was fascinating as an outside observer to go see how an Amazon, a Microsoft, and a Google kind of responded, to this. And, there was, credit to Amazon, they backed, kind of their individual, contributor who was like, I'm going to go fork this. And they're like, yeah, you should, and we'll support you. And then that kind of got Google and Oracle. And then, Microsoft ended up playing them both ways. I'm like, yeah, we'll work with the commercial, but, we'll keep an eye on the Valkey, kind of community. And, what was interesting, was in my role at Major League Baseball was to be having these conversations. We were on top of Google Cloud and talking with the product managers behind the Google memory store and like seeing, the behavior, understanding apps and everything and, kind of, it's understanding that tension. And so it's one of these things where you do it on open source and somehow the social construct breaks down. Okay, they decide to relicense it. The hyperscalers and kind of the public cloud providers basically fork it. And then they kind of get their ecosystem and they're able to kind of resolve, kind of the tension. And then it's like, okay, as a downstream consumer, what are the key tenants to Valkey, at least initially, compatible. So it's like, replace, kind of your Redis dependency with the Valkey, and it should just work. But hey, now you get all these features and things that the upstream community really had been through, and now doing it in an open source kind of manner is a really enlightening one. It's a very kind of pleased to see, kind of that effort, but in some sense, it's a natural reaction if you understand kind of the dynamics. And you see this that again, maybe 10, 15 years ago, if a commercial company had decided to, kind of shift, and relicense, would you have seen the hyperscalers like, no, we're going to go fork it and then we're going to, and so you get these individual developers, working at these companies, Amazon and Google and Microsoft, kind of that they're working on these projects. And you see people jumping from the cloud providers, and you see people at Google going to Microsoft, people at Microsoft going to Amazon, and in Seattle area, like you can probably see from the right vantage point, you can see the Google office, the Microsoft office, and the Amazon office.
Yeah.
Right? Ecosystem in that, there's a good phrase that, kind of the community adopted is, kind of, different teams, same team. I was working at Microsoft. I'm working on Kubernetes. Today, I'm working at Oracle, working on Kubernetes. I'm working at NVIDIA. I'm working on Kubernetes. Doesn't change who I am. And so that's a really interesting ecosystem that gives a lot of power, to the individual kind of developers in a way that, may not have been there. If you were at an organization and it was like, hey, decision was made to relicense, and it's like, I don't agree with it. Well, now I can go across the street and I can go to Microsoft. I can go to Google. I can go to Amazon or Oracle or whomever, and still work on the same project.
Yeah, I never thought it on this perspective. Is a nice way to see this individual collaboration through companies that they can change and rotate, but it's basically working on the same package because the package is outside of the company. That's a interesting way to see it. I mean, I really visualize the people also moving between buildings, often very close one to the other. Talking about open source, going beyond just code, open source represents also a value system of transparency, community, meritocracy. How has this ethos influenced the culture of modern tech organization? Does a company that eagerly use open source have a sort of ethical obligation to adopt this transparent principle also in other areas? Thinking about these days, for example, in a artificial intelligence model, the development, or talking about data privacy. So there is some sort of influence when we talk about open source that goes beyond what is just code, but really on the way of treating the development model and the data.
Yeah, and I've been really, kind of fortunate to have been at large organizations going through kind of cultural changes. And that was one of the really exciting things when I came to Bloomberg in 2012 was it was in the middle of basically a mindset change that, okay, rather than relying on proprietary software, like the open source community does it better than we can. And that was a big fundamental shift for an organization, to be able to kind of like know, like we have to go use commercial software. That's the only way to do it. And to basically be there, during this inflection point to be like, actually, no, we can do, consume open source. And then really one of the things that was really empowering at Bloomberg was to be able to contribute back to open source and to basically say, there's a lot of benefit that Bloomberg was receiving, but there was also, hard problems that the open source community hadn't solved yet. It was like, rather than forth a new project, it was like work with upstream to be able to do that. And so that was really, kind of an empowering, transformation to see, was to truly understand the open source ethos of not, okay, I don't have to look at it as a black box. I can say, okay, look, I can go hire these people that work in this community, or I can introduce, smart people to these open source kind of communities and be able to kind of get back and improve the product and be able to serve, kind of our needs. And, that was a really, fundamental kind of transition. And, I was just a part of that. And that still kind of continues. I've been gone, kind of 8 years now, and I still talk to friends at Bloomberg, and like, yeah, we're still contributing to open source and giving back, and kind of contributing, and that's really where the benefit is. And then Major League Baseball, much smaller kind of team, and really the transformation there was to rely on open source and to basically kind of consume. In a couple cases, there were some patches upstream, but for the most part, at Major League Baseball, it was like, the stuff that the open source kind of community provided, was actually good enough. We didn't have to go, use, kind of proprietary databases or event buses. And so that was a lot of the work that kind of the team was able to do, was like, okay, let's build on top of open source. Let's go move to Postgres. Let's go move to Redis. Let's go move to, open source, kind of ecosystems running on top of the public cloud, for the most part. But, there's a small footprint, kind of at each ballpark, but, kind of going open source first. And that really allows the evolution of the software and kind of the velocity to be like, okay, there was also a big effort, kind of, when I joined Major League Baseball, there really wasn't it was like, okay, we're going to basically get, this version of Java that even then, 8 years ago was like 10 years out of date. And it was like, no, the point of using open source is that you should be getting advances that are coming from the ecosystem. And it was like, okay, yes, you're on Java, but like, hey, are you upgrading, to the latest LTS version? Same thing with Node, same thing with, kind of React, other things. So it's not just to be, at a point in time and say, yeah, we use React. It's like, okay, you have to stay up to date, on the latest versions. And that way you have compatibility, enhancements, all this, the rising tide lifts all boats. And yes, it does, but you have to have the investment to be able to, kind of regularly, stay up to date. And to stay abreast of, okay, yeah, they made some great improvements in React. Okay, are you using it? What's your timeline for getting that out, and making it easier to kind of consume and kind of get the integration faster?
Yeah, the open source can really be a engine for innovation, as you were saying. But coming back to one of the points you also already mentioned, as we look ahead, what are the biggest challenges that you see as challenges facing the open source model in a world that is dominated by a few global cloud platforms? Are we at risk of seeing the innovation stiff as a hyperscaler absorb or embrace and extend critical open source projects? What can the community do to maintain a decentralized and truly open future? We already seen, you mentioned already before, some license modification that have been done by some of the major open source projects, as MongoDB, Redis, you mentioned before, Elastic. We also saw already some recent changes that sort of reverting back what was adding more limitation that were applied. How this is affecting the open source evolution, the open source community, and what could we expect looking ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to kind of the tension of, you want to make it as easy to kind of consume and deliver value, whatever your end value is, it kind of as an integrator and as a developer. And I think fundamentally open source has proven, 25, 30 years, that it is produce the right frameworks and allow you to move up the value chain to like, what is your problem? What is the thing that you are trying to solve? And basically relying on that open source, but there's always these tensions, and I've seen it over the 25 plus year career in open source. Is kind of VC money's kind of come in and they're like, hey, yeah, we just raised $1 billion for this open source project. Oh no, like, it can get forked and like, what do they actually, kind of buy? And I think you're starting to see even in the AI space, it's still a very, kind of uncertain landscape. And you have, kind of, big dominant players, and you've got this hardware ecosystem that is fundamentally just hardware. It's things that I can't iterate as fast as software. And I think it'll be interesting to see kind of this dynamic kind of evolve, over time. And, see, okay, great, yes, kind of, if I'm relying on NVIDIA and I'm relying on CUDA, and it's like, okay, these are the AI things, and you're seeing a lot of work right now in the training side and doing, massive data center, kind of investment that is indirectly solving the problem. Really solving the problem to be done is inference, and it's being able to, use that to provide things, if you're a Bloomberg or you're a Major League Baseball or any other kind of customer, and it's like, okay, how am I delivering value? And for the most part, that's going to be around inferencing. And I think, what is the open source, ecosystem look like? Certainly a lot of it is built around open source, and certainly in the Python space, you're seeing all of these kind of tools, but it's still kind of an unsettled kind of landscape of like, okay, how do I server model? How do I do that at scale? There's a lot of different fascinating, and I think you can look at, when I started out 25 years ago, it was like Linux operating systems and web servers. Then it became like, those databases, and Postgres has a long, rich history. Then it got to be like, frameworks and like Node.js and Java and things like that. And then it, kind of became the cloud and Kubernetes and Terraform and, all of these cloud native tooling. And I think you're going to be seeing over the next 5 to 10 years is really going to be around the AI story. And open source, I think, is going to be a big part of that. In what shape or form? And, you've got all this money, listening to, an odd lot podcast, and there's like this tension models and closed models and kind of open weights and kind of closed weights, and what does it really mean, and what is the value of a community of and you certainly see players like Hugging Face that are like, what, if I'm a researcher working on AI, I want to get that feedback. I want that kind of the open source mentality of hey, if there's a better way to do it, let me know. And so I really think it's to be written what that AI, open source, kind of ecosystem looks like. It can still be powered by, kind of the public clouds. You've got the TPUs, you've got the GPUs, you've got all of the hardware ecosystem. But at the end of the day, training is only going to do so much. You have to do the inferencing. Open source, inferencing is there's stories yet to be told, and doing that at scale and what that looks like, and being built around open source. I think that's going to be seeing that. I'm like, oh yeah.
No, I kept note of some of the while you were talking to try to grab some of the keywords or key elements of this conversation. So I'll try just to mention these keywords or key sentences that I structured, and just then to let you review or try to to see if I got the message of this have to be corrected. So what I took note of, open source, we say, has been embedded in the cloud platform since the beginning, for the fact that it was bringing portability between clouds, public and private, and then because open source at the beginning was on the, let's say, lower layers as a foundation for the cloud to answer or what were the common questions or common problems. But with the cloud native architecture, open source is elevating on a higher level of the stack due to the more complex architecture and new needs that are there. I keep track of, after the conversation, about the fact that there is a tension between cloud vendors and open source. We cannot deny that. It's a sort of a love and hate situation between the two, but we need to avoid to underestimate the individual contribution that are allowed by these big vendors. And the fact that the open source proved in the last 20 years how the model can really enable innovation and how it can also be resilient and adapting to the solution. And finally, a matching between these two words is cloud provider. They provide the scale for storage and compute services where the open source is providing the core of the platform there. I don't know if you agree, if I get it correctly, with where the key points. So if you want to wrap up the discussion with just a couple of sentences and see if I got it right or things to be corrected or added on.
I think the one point I would make is, you see a lot of investment, in Kubernetes, right? And it's like, how do I deal with things? It's got a lot of like what Bloomberg brought to the, kind of the Apache Solar community was how to operate at scale. And so it's not just the building blocks. I think you will see like, okay, how do I solve this, kind of large scale problems and do this in a open source, kind of way? Because fundamentally, could I run everything on a single machine and just have it be, kind of, on a single machine? Like, yeah, I could, but, this is really where there is a lot of, open source, infrastructure that's underlying, okay, I managed to do that at scale. And, certainly, kind of the more sophisticated, kind of multi-cloud, kind of consumers is like, okay, what are my substrates? Okay, I have a Kubernetes, I have a Postgres, I have a scalable, kind of block storage or object storage. Those are the fundamentals, and then I can go build, whatever the business value is on top of that, to go serve whatever it is that my business and is needing. And so, I wouldn't discount, open source just to be, kind of the individual building blocks. It's a lot of orchestration. It's a lot of, kind of what is powered by the cloud. And that's really, what has been useful about, the OpenStack kind of community. Like, is it going to necessarily, scale up to, kind of the Amazons or the Microsofts? Like, no. They're doing massive, substantial, infrastructure investment, but it is allowing kind of those smaller deployments where it wouldn't make sense for an Amazon or a public cloud to be able to do the infrastructure kind of investment. But if you're a Bloomberg, it's like, yeah, we're going to go make this infrastructure investment because that's part of, kind of their value proposition to their customers is we're going to give you that level of service, and needing kind of a private cloud. And so having that kind of range, but then having that portability by, okay, OpenStack, is providing these APIs. I can go do that with the Kubernetes. I can do that completely in a different environment, doing it at these massive, kind of data centers that have power and connectivity, but it's also latency. It's one of the reasons why Major League Baseball, racks of gear at each ballpark. There's just stuff that you just can't do outside the ballpark. You need to have a footprint. And so that edge kind of infrastructure that, okay, it's not going to make sense for Google or Amazon or any of the public cloud providers to go put a data center. And you can kind of see Outpost and other things where they say, okay, go put our racks in there. But again, what are the constraints of that environment? It may be just more easy to go, okay, let's go figure out, how to do an OpenStack and Kubernetes deployment, on the existing footprint that I have of power and space and cooling, and be able to provide, kind of services on top of that. So I think open source has done a lot to help with the orchestration of these things. And it's not just, when I was starting out, it's like just a building block. I think now you see that and, just kind of the understanding. And, certainly, we haven't really talked about, stuff like Terraform or other things that, are allowing, okay, I want to put up these components. Well, that's an important part of, how the things kind of come together and, and that as a valuable open source utility. We could talk longer, I'm sure, about what is Terraform really ability to say, okay, I've got a Terraform module that works on Azure. Does it work on Google? Probably not, but it's at least captured. It's at least it's not, someone clicking into a command, interface or, a website. It's like at least deterministic, and it gives me a starting point to say, okay, here are the resource providers that I use in Azure. How would that map to Amazon or Google? Because there are always be business decisions that really not necessarily technically driven. It's like you're going to have to migrate clouds or, kind of new things. And it's like, okay, how do I do that? So you need Terraform, which is, incredibly important orchestration to say, hey, how do I do these things? And you get Kubernetes. And it's like you kind of combine the Terraform and Kubernetes, and you get a really nice environment that is declarative, it's consistent, it's reproducible. And that's a great, kind of asset of the open source in the cloud.
Yeah, we can really, it would be impossible to imagine the modern open cloud environments without all those important open source projects that you mentioned. I mean, that they really build up things and makes also things portable between clouds. All of the concept and the common architecture and common layers between things. Now, I want to thank you a lot for the time you spent with us. It has been really, really interesting to have this discussion with you.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, thanks a lot. I hope we will have another chance to proceed with this another discussion. And thanks you, Justin, again. Thanks for every one of you listening to CODE&CLOUD. The conversation doesn't stop here, so join us on our social account to share your thoughts on today's topics. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review. It will really help others to find us, but it will also help us to understand if we are doing things right and in the right direction. Be sure to follow us as you don't miss the next episode, where we will be talking about app development today, hype, reality, and trade-off with Gianni Dimitri, mobile product designer and mobile developer. And until next time, keep your code clean and your cloud scalable. And as we used to say in Newesis, be professional and have fun.